Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Now, we're taking questions that have been submitted by way of the website, and you'll see the website here on the right-hand side. That's where you sign up for the daily email. If you get the daily email, you will be able to answer, or ask rather, questions that you want by simply hitting reply. And you'll see there that coming from me, hit reply, ask your question. I kind of put those questions together in the queue and get ready to make groups of similar types of questions that we can answer here on the show. And here is a group today that really has to do with answering some objections about the nature of faith, the nature of belief. And I want to answer a couple of them here and take our time to kind of parse these out, because as somebody who is a Christian evidentialist, I often get asked, well, okay, look, how is it you think that faith relates to evidence? A book that's called Forensic Faith, which I've written, talking about this relationship between evidence and belief, evidence and a Christian worldview, evidence and a more reasonable, evidential Christian faith, is sometimes confusing for a lot of people who maybe weren't raised that way or to think about faith involving evidence at all. So let's answer a couple of questions I've gotten by way of email. Here's one sent in. It says, "Dear Jim, a friend of mine on Facebook challenged me and said that the only reason I was a Christian was because I had been raised in America, here in America, in an overwhelmingly Christian country. He said if I had been raised in Syria, I would have been a Muslim. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Can you help me?" So that's a great a question to ask, and I think it's offered. I've seen that offered as a quick kind of Twitter 140-word objection. You know, you're only a Christian because you're raised in a Christian country. If you've been raised in someplace else, you'd be a Buddhist or a Hindu or whatever. The idea here is that this has nothing to do with whether or not Christianity or your religious views are true. You just happen to be holding on to the things because they're part of your culture. It's not as though, and so in other words, you should question their truth nature, their truth validity, because it's almost as if you eat certain foods because you were raised in certain parts of the country. It has nothing to do with whether that food is true or not. So you're doing the same thing with your religious beliefs. Okay, that's the objection. How would we even respond to that? Well, I think we need to say a couple things about it. Number one, that really doesn't seem to even be consistent with the growth and the emergence of Christianity, the growth of Christianity, even the way that Christianity is accepted by millions of believers today. Here's what I mean by that. Let's take a look at this in these categories. First of all, that claim that you're only a Christian because you were raised in a Christian environment doesn't even seem to be consistent with the history of the ancient world in which Christianity first began. Now think about that for a second. Christianity, if you know, in the first century, it wasn't as though there were a bunch of benign, open-minded, pluralistic, fluid religious believers. No, it emerged in a largely Jewish or pagan culture that was antagonistic toward the first believers, toward the Christian church. These were either polytheistic believers in the Roman Empire. These were people who believed in one God, as the Jews, who always thought it was blasphemy for Jesus to call himself God. They were completely hostile to the claims of Christianity. Okay, yet in that hostile environment, which was clearly not majority Christian, at one point, the smallest religious group that could be found anywhere in the region was Christian. Yet this thing explodes and takes off and grows quickly and dramatically. Well, if Christianity if Christian believers are only Christian because they are raised up surrounded by other Christians, tell me how this happens then how does Christianity ever get off the ground? It gets off the ground because just the opposite occurred. This idea that you're only a Christian because your culture is Christian also seems to run against the history of specific regions, like, for example, the history of China. This is a country that's had, historically, an historical experience of suppression especially when related to any religious beliefs that aren't the native religious beliefs of Shunism or Taoism. And here's Christianity growing in huge numbers as an underground church. Really kind of under the, it's really don't look, don't tell. In spite of all the influence and the pressure of government against Christianity, it's still growing as an underground movement. Now, okay, so it's clearly not growing because it started off with this inertia from everyone being a Christian. It was just the opposite. So I'm not quite sure if you're saying that Christians are only Christians because they're raised in a Christian environment. How do you explain the first century church? How do you explain countries like China? How do you explain, for example, the history of persecution we see everywhere, even today, against Christians in the Middle East? But certainly in the first 500 years of let's say the first 300 years of the church, the persecution, it was not just that it wasn't popular or wasn't the mainstream religious belief, is that it was the hostily persecuted religious belief of a minority. And in spite of that intense pushback, it grows. So I don't think you can argue that Christians are only Christians because they are raised in a Christian environment. This is a third reason why you can't argue that. But not only that, lots of you watching this know in your own personal history, this doesn't jive. So many of us as Christians have a history where, look, we are definitely a predominantly Christian nation, even now, at least and people who would self-identify. Still, the most of us would self-identify as some form of Christian. But we live in a country that has the freedom that allows people to choose whatever they want. And this is how competing religious worldviews grow in our country. This happens all the time. This is why someone like Jim Wallace can be raised in a very non-Christian environment. My mom, was raised as a Catholic, but really, she was almost like a cultural Catholic growing up. And so I rejected it early. My dad was a very committed atheist. I knew of no other Christians anywhere in my extended family, yet here I am. So it's not as though I was influenced by people who raised me in Christian. I expect the first really religious worldview that I looked at with any real self-interest, in other words, I was actually interested in it, was the Baha'i faith. I just didn't think it was true. I got done examining it. I would have been happy if Mormonism had been true. I just didn't end up as a Mormon, even though I had Mormons in my family, because I don't think it's true. Lots of us are just like this, where we have examined and we have the freedom. Look, the largest group, you could argue, in terms of growth in America is not Christians, it's Muslims. So how is that happening if people only believe what they believe because they're in the majority in their country? So I think this idea is demonstrably false. And you can make the case that it's demonstrably false in these four different ways. There's really no reason to believe that this is what, at least if you have to say that, then Jim, you're lying, and people like you are lying, because you don't appear to be somebody who became a Christian because you were surrounded by a Christian environment. And honestly, I didn't even know any. We laughed looking back at it, Susie and I, because we said, wow, if there were Christians in our life growing up, where were they? I don't ever remember being approached by a Christian to kind of encourage me to look at Christianity. We kind of bumped into it on our own. And I think that's probably true for a lot of you. And that demonstrates that really that's not why. So that's what I would offer. I'd offer back to the person who's objecting 4 examples of how this is just the opposite. In the early church, in countries where it's still in the minority, clearly the history of persecution and the lives of many Christians who today were not raised in this environment at all, yet here we are still professing to be Christians. To take a break, we'll come back and talk about one more issue related to faith and belief.
Jay Warner and Susie Wallace have written 3 kids' books to help children know the truth and defend it in the public square. All 3 books mirror Jay Warner's adult books, chapter by chapter. And best yet, the kids' books are written as fictional stories that will turn your kids into detectives as they solve mysteries and learn about Christianity. There's also an interactive academy website at casemakersacademy.com where your kids can join other cadets and complete their own academy notebook. Each course has free videos, activity sheets, and more. Your young readers can even earn their own Junior Detective graduation certificates and appear on the Honor Cadet Wall. Be sure to visit casemakersacademy.com to learn more.
We're back with LA homicide detective Jay Warner Wallace to talk about how forensic investigative skills can make us better communicators of faith in God. And Jim, this comes from your book, Forensic Faith.
Right.
You've really dived into all of these things. And I think people who love this whole idea of criminal cases and investigation are going to love your approach on this.
I hope so. I mean, I think there are some transferable skill sets, right? Especially when we're trying to communicate complicated ideas. And sometimes the most important thing we can do, I think, is decide who it is we're going to communicate those ideas to. So if someone asks me, well, how can I be a better communicator? We're tempted to kind of give them ideas about tactics and how to say certain things. But honestly, when people ask me, well, how do you win criminal cases? In that entire process in which you start, there's an opening statement, there's an evidence show where we'll do weeks and weeks of presenting evidence to the jury. Then there'll be a closing argument, and then they go into jury deliberation. But it turns out that the cases really are won and lost. It almost sounds kind of sad.
I hate that you say
I know,
this. You say
I know.
it even before the trial starts.
Yes,
it's jury
selection.
Oh,
It's jury selection.
But isn't it about truth? That's
It
just
is,
so
but
annoying.
the problem is that so many of us will have a presuppositional bias that might prevent us from ever even adopting any view other than our own. And we just need to know before we start, is the jury in that category? I think there are different layers of kinds of jurors. And in any trial, we have two groups that are in the room that we're selecting jurors from. People who are generally pro-prosecution and people who are generally pro-defense. And the defense attorneys don't want people who are leaning toward the prosecutor.
Yes.
And the prosecutor doesn't want people who are leaning toward the defense attorney. So figuring out where people fall in this spectrum helps us to seat a panel, hopefully, of people in the middle. Maybe inclined one direction or the other, but not so inclined that they won't even listen. So we're looking for the open middle. Well, the same thing is true for us who are communicating the Christian worldview. If you spend some time with people, you kind of know where they are on a spectrum, and I've kind of written about it in the book. But when I've got somebody I know is in the far spectrum who is so close-minded, I have to have a different strategy for that person. I call that a group 4, category 4 person. There are category 1s, though, that are so committed to Christianity. Are like, hey, I don't even need to know what evidence there is because I'm already in. But you know what? You probably have someone in your family who's in that middle area, who are younger probably in that group of the millennials or Gen Z, who are having open questions. They would call themselves Christians still, but they want to know it. I'm open to the possibility this isn't true. Well, that's when those group 1s who are committed, who don't even think the evidence is important, need to start to take a more evidential approach, because the first person that your kids are going to talk about and ask questions, it's not going to be Jim Wallace. It's not going to be any apologist who's writing a book. It's going to be mom and dad.
Yeah.
And if you haven't mastered the answers, if you haven't thought about the answers, well, then they're never going to pick up my book. You're never going to be able to go the next step, which is, well, read Forensic Faith. Well, that's not going to happen. We need to read these things.
Yeah.
We need to, as parents, be the best apologists that our kids know.
And I think about what you're saying, a lot of kids lose faith when they go to university. It's that intellectual time where they're receiving so much information, so much of it is kind of hostile to faith. And if there's no intellectual defense for that.
That's right.
Right, that's where they really need it. So I think as parents, you're absolutely right. And also you say in the book that people say, okay, you're talking about an invisible God, so you need overwhelming evidence to prove he exists. But you say in a criminal trial that there's rarely, if never, overwhelming evidence.
Yeah, you need like extraordinary evidence to prove an extraordinary claim. Well, every homicide is in some ways extraordinary, depending how unusual it is. Not many homicides, actually, you might think there's a large number, but relative to population size, homicides are incredibly rare. And the kind of homicide can make it even rarer. Yet when we go to trial, we don't say, well, now what kind of evidence? No, you're going to use the same mundane forms of evidence you would use to do a petty theft. It doesn't have to be extraordinary. It just has to be, is it beyond a reasonable doubt? And we do this all the time. Now, I think we need to be able to adopt that view of faith, not a blind faith that doesn't even know what the evidence is, and not an unreasonable faith that believes something in spite of evidence to the contrary, but a forensic faith that has to take a step of trust. I can't answer every question in the Christian worldview, but I've got enough evidence here to incline me in this direction, so that step of trust is very short relative to what I already know. And that's what Jesus would say, because he spent 40 days with the disciples after the resurrection, giving them many convincing proofs. Why? Well, isn't the resurrection enough? No, he knew the heart of humans, and he knew that we needed to have those doubts answered. And he stayed around for 40 extra days giving convincing proof, so that, yes, there'll still be a step of trust. This still seems crazy that I rose from the grave, but I've given you enough evidence to make your faith forensic.
And you know, we live in a culture, and I think especially here in Canada, where people really believe that faith should be private. Like there's a sense of like, we don't talk about it, it's our personal thing, you have yours, I have mine, and really mine can be a mixture of 7 different faiths, you know.
Yes, a smorgasbord.
Yeah, so how do we start those conversations without being kind of the annoying person who's always trying to shove your faith down someone's throat?
Well, I think what we do is we ask good questions. And most people in this, we talk about communication, the prosecutors do, is we ask good questions. And then we let the answers kind of speak for themselves. So learning how to ask good questions. And remember, this is not an argument we're having. I don't want to be argumentative, but we may formulate an argument for why. What I mean is a logical, step-by-step position we take that leads us to some truth claim. But it's really about a character issue, right? Am I willing to communicate? Do I know my juror well enough to know what makes that juror tick? And know what to say and what not to say. And so we talk about this a little bit in the book, but in the end, I really want the Christians I know to realize that if we continue to hold to our faith like a subjective opinion, then get ready to have those opinions run over. Because the culture is making claims about moral claims about all kinds of things that they will argue objectively. And then you as Christians want to adopt this view subjectively? If it's a matter of an objective truth claim made by the culture versus a subjective opinion held by Christians, then get ready for your subjective opinions to collide and get run over. We need to now make the case objectively for whether, I don't even like sometimes the fact that Christianity is true. There's days when it's hard to be a Christian, right?
Yeah.
But it's true objectively. It's not a matter of my personal opinion. And I have to be able to make that case for my kids so that they know, even on a day when they feel like chasing their passions, Christianity is still true.
And there's so much evidence, and you go over that in this book. You're going to want to pick up this book, Forensic Faith. Thank you so much for coming. There's so much more. I feel like we just touched the surface, but that means that people got to get the book, right?
That's right. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
We'll be right back.
Okay, I want to answer this question, which I'm going to spin off a little bit because I think so many good issues are raised here. This is to somebody who writes, Detective Wallace. If Christianity is obviously true as you say it is, why isn't everyone a believer? Doesn't the fact that more and more people reject Christianity prove that the case for Christianity is not strong? Okay, that's a great question. Number one, it talks about the relationship, at least it mentions the relationship between evidence. If the evidence is so strong, why doesn't everybody believe something? I've argued that there are 3 ways to look at faith, to look at any belief. One is to believe something that is unreasonable. You're believing something in spite of evidence to the contrary. That's an unreasonable belief. If you believe, for example, that you can get warts from frogs, you hold an unreasonable belief. We have evidence now that tells us where you get warts from. It's not from frogs. So that you now hold an unreasonable belief. The other kind of belief you can hold is a belief that you hold, it could be true, but you don't even know why it's true because you've never really looked at the evidence to discover if it was evidentially true. You just held this belief. Maybe somebody told you and you trusted them, so you believed it, and you've never tested it. That you could be in the right place or the wrong place. You don't really know because you haven't really tested it. And that kind of blind belief in something on the basis of authority, which could, not to say that authority is not a good reason to believe something, of course it is, but you haven't checked it out for yourself. You just have believed it on the basis of an experience, something that, not an experience, but an authority who told you something, you were raised that way perhaps, your parents believed that thing. I get it, there's a blind belief there. You could be right in what you believe, but you could be wrong, you just haven't really looked at it to see. Then the third category is a forensic belief that is built on a good source of evidence that gave you good reason to believe it's true. Even a kind of evidence that you could then publicly demonstrate to others, which is the root nature of the word forensic. So this is a belief that is derived from evidence, even though no case made from evidence is entirely complete. Every case, even cases for true things, still have unanswered questions. So you're going to have to step from the evidence to a commitment to that belief, even though you have unanswered questions. We do this in every criminal trial. Every jury does that, by the way. But they're not making a decision unreasonably. They're not making a decision blindly, but they still have to step out, even though they don't have, a video camera or a video record of what actually happened. They may not have a confession. They think they've got more than enough reason to believe he's guilty, but they've got to make a step of trust in something that is demonstrated with evidence yet still has unanswered questions. That is a form of faith. That is a form of believing something in spite of unanswered questions. And so I would say that's a forensic belief. So the same thing happens in terms of faith. You can hold an unreasonable faith. I think that for example, that Mormons hold an unreasonable faith because they believe in something that there's evidence that's clearly to the contrary. I don't think I can trust Joseph given what he did with the Book of Abraham and lots of other things. But the point is, that's an unreasonable belief. I think it's also an unreasonable faith. You can hold a faith, though, blindly. I have lots of friends who are in the right place as Christians but don't even know why it's true. And then you could hold a forensic faith. The great thing about a forensic faith is that you could actually make a case for that kind of faith in the public square. Again, the root of the word forensic. Now, I say all that as a foundation because now we're going to talk about this question. Let's go back to it again. If Christianity is obviously as true as you say it is, why isn't everyone a believer? Okay, let's just talk about that for a second. Well, that's because, as you know, and I've talked about this both in cold case Christianity and a little bit in forensic faith, this idea that there are many reasons why someone rejects a truth claim, and not all of them are rational. But I call this why people shun the truth. And so here's the first one. It's a play on words. Some people shun the truth. They reject rationally. See how I'm using that little play on words? In other words, there are people who simply have rational doubts. They don't think the evidence is strong enough. And you'll recognize this kind of pushback when someone makes a statement that's based in evidence. I don't think there's enough evidence on that. I think the evidence points to something else. I'm not convinced. I need more evidence. Well, that's somebody who is, now keep in mind that people will often offer words that sound like they're rational objectors when they're not really rational objectors. But I'm just saying, this is a category which I think is reasonable. Somebody can just not believe something is true because the evidence doesn't point to it. They can be persuaded, though, if this is really where they lie. Because if the evidence does point to it, you could actually impact their beliefs by providing evidence. There's another group, though, that reject for something other than rational reasons. These are people who have emotional objections. They have doubts that are purely emotional. They know some hypocrites. They have got a father who maybe was a Christian, or a mom who was a Christian, and they have a reaction, an emotional reaction to that person. Well, that's not about, examining the evidence for the manuscript transmission or the evidence for the resurrection. That's about just not liking something on an emotional basis. And when you see that, that's a whole different approach. You can offer all the evidence you want to offer. It doesn't mean you're going to convince anybody, because if they hold an emotional, you're going to have to kind of talk that through first. By the way, most of us as case makers, as Christian apologists, we have a tendency to sit still in that one lane of rationality when in fact it may be an emotional issue we're overlooking. And there's a third reason why people reject something, and that is volitionally. Lots of folks don't want something to be true. This is a matter of will. What are you willing to bend your knee to? Are there some things you are unwilling to bend your knee to? And this is, I don't think anyone's ever going to say it the way I put it on the screen there. But when you see people say, hey, I'm not willing to, I don't want it to be true. I don't care if it is true. I'm not going to bend my knee to it. Well, no one's probably going to say that. As a matter of fact, I think that most people will hold emotional and volitional objections, but when asked about it, will present them as though they're purely rational objections. Because who in the world wants to admit they have an emotional reaction to something or don't want something to be true? Most of us want to be seen as rational. And so what happens is that most of us will not use a word that would give away an emotional or volitional resistance. Now, I'm not saying that to say that people who don't think Christianity is true are all emotional or volitional train wrecks. That would not be fair. There are people who think the evidence is just not good enough. Okay, then that's why we want to take time then to examine the evidence with them. If that's really where they fall, we could actually have some impact on this. But even if you did it, you took the time to articulate why evidentially Christian is true. Does this mean that everyone's going to land in the same place? No. This is true in juries too, by the way. You can make a case and the jurors sitting right next to each other may come to two different conclusions. And here's how I typically will put it. Look at your screen. I will usually say that two people can evaluate one piece of evidence and come to two different conclusions. Happens all the time. Why? Why do two people look at the same piece of evidence? You'll see in the middle line there, it's one piece of, they're looking at the same one piece of evidence, yet they're coming to two different conclusions. How does that happen? Because a lot of things go into your decision making other than just the facts, the evidence. what you like, what you don't like, what you want to be true, what you don't want to be true, how you've lived, your passions, your interests. All of these things can really have an impact on how you make a decision. And the example I'd like to give is the example of Bart Ehrman, who is this famous skeptic who's written so many good books. I mean, really, they're interesting books, but they make a case against Christianity. He's making a case against the manuscript evidence of the New Testament. He's making a case against the validity of Scripture. And he's using the manuscripts, the ancient evidences from manuscripts, to make a case against Christianity. He's well tutored. He grew up in the church. He knows Christianity. He went from his youth group. He graduated high school. He went to Moody Bible Institute, to Wheaton College to get his master's, to Princeton. He studied underneath one of the best biblical scholars of the last century, Bruce Metzger. And yet Bart does not believe that the manuscript evidence points to the reliability of Scripture. He believes it points to the unreliability of Scripture. Meanwhile, his mentor, who got all three of his degrees at Princeton and was clearly, of the two, it wasn't Bart mentoring Bruce, it was Bruce mentoring Bart. Both of these individuals were looking at the exact same manuscript evidence, yet came to two dramatically different conclusions. And Bruce would say, when interviewed by Lee Strobel, that he was a skeptic. He treated things skeptically. He pushed. He knew what the objections were. He wanted to know if it was true, and he came to the conclusion it was true, that Christianity was true. Well, how is it that these two people can look at the same physical evidence yet come to two very different conclusions? It's because it's back to our rational, emotional, volitional issues, that there's something else going on that's not necessarily about the evidence, but it's about how each person receives the evidence. So just keep that in mind. We talk about that a lot in our book, Forensic Faith, so you can see it. And hopefully it's helpful to kind of give you a sense of how you can approach your friends, because the book Forensic Faith is really about how to make the case, why you need to be a more reasonable, evidential Christian believer, and then how to make that case reasonably and evidentially to others. So hopefully that'll help you. But this is why two people will look at the same piece of evidence and come to two different conclusions. I hope that kind of helps you think about the relationship between evidence, belief, and faith, and the categories of faith that we often talk about here. And I'll see you back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.